I wanted to start this today by looking at all of us looking at some images which most of us will have seen time and again. It's the way in which Chinese Canadians have usually been portrayed. And I've called it the old history, what we've seen in the past. And these are, at least for me, these are sort of typical images, and they're images around and about. First, I wanted to start out with an important reminder, which is that the Chinese population in British Columbia was for a long time dominantly male. And I think one realizes that. And so when we look at the images, we see it more vividly. But from this, you can see that, in fact, the number of married ladies, as it was called in 1885, was something like 59 for the whole province as compared to 10,000 men, and then to which they added 72 prostitutes, which was something, given the nature of attitudes toward the Chinese, you will see why, in fact, prostitutes was a nice, convenient category in terms of discrediting people. A number of people 17 and under, which clearly included, individuals, particularly men coming early on. And the other thing I think that we need to keep in mind is that the population, and this is a time when Vancouver is just coming into being, but the population was in fact distributed around the province. It was not solely in what we think of as Chinatowns in Victoria or in New Westminster. And then there are men who were involved in railway construction. And you can see this is just a background to the images. There's no quiz at the end, so don't worry. And this is, I think, indicative of the nature of the great disparity between men and women, is that families were often, because there were so few families, they were often not only had their pictures done, because they were often businessmen's family, but they've survived. And these are in the provincial archives. And this is a family in Victoria. Then there's this picture, which is an unnamed woman in Victoria. And I don't know whether unnamed means that they like to think of her as a prostitute, or whether because they just have forgotten what her name was. But you get an idea. And here's the family. We've lost the headings, but that's okay. The headings are over here. This is a family in Victoria in the 1880s. And again, it survives probably because it is a family and there were so few families, so it was considered to be exceptional. This is the woman in Victoria that is not identified. This is another Victoria family, which again, because there were so few women, as you saw from that earlier image, these become significant. And another family, here was a family in 1911, and for some of the same reasons. And here there's, I think, an important reminder. If I had more time, I could have given you equivalent pictures of white families who are dressed, and that dress would appear to us in the present day to be just as peculiar. So I think we have to understand that these are families who are dressing in particular ways. And this one is interesting because you have the sons who are sort of westernized. And this, again, the idea of all of the dominance of men. This is a Joss house where single men would spend their spare time in Victoria. And this is a picture of the girls who are at a girls' home. Christian missionaries got very keen very early on the Chinese and were convinced that all of these young women, there were all kinds of young women coming to Victoria to be trained, be prepared to be prostitutes. And they established a rescue home. And here it's called rescued slaves. And they would pick up young women or teenage girls that they found on the streets and literally physically drag them into the home. And this is a picture sort of which was done in the newspaper. It's a newspaper in Nova Scotia, which was for the purpose of raising funds. And this is probably the best known picture, which is done from the perspective of the dominant society when there was huge, incredible determination to keep more Chinese from coming, and at the extreme to remove the Chinese who were here. And this is the second set of pictures in terms of the old history, and these are ones which are more realistic in the sense that they're about business life. What were these people doing apart from posing in pictures? And this is from Victoria Businesses in 1890 in the Chinese area of Victoria. And then here you have an early family in Vancouver who are running a laundry. And you have a market gardener from the early time period. And you have someone who's essentially a salesman, a door-to-door salesman, which I grew up with where I grew up with door-to-door salesmen. But This is the Chinese version of it. And another one, which comes again. These are all in, and I chose these from the provincial archives because you can go online and see them for yourself. These are railway workers in Kamloops. It was a huge number of thousands of Chinese men who were recruited from China to build the transcontinental rail line, and all of those essentially stayed. One story has them being promised transportation back home. It wasn't provided, and so they were sort of abandoned wherever they happened to be, whatever small town it was. But it was mainly in British Columbia that they worked. And then you had all of the men who were miners, which you saw in that first picture. And if you go back full circle, this is a picture of a miner who came in 1871, and the picture was taken in 1912, 1913. And it was taken, obviously, to emphasize the fact that he was a single, solitary, unmarried male. And this is a cook in Barkerville in 1916. And again, this tells you about their role in the economy. And one of the as many of you know, one of the best, most accurate depictors of Chinese Canadians was C.D. Howe, who was settled, a Chinese man. This is his self-portrait. It was settled in Barkerville in the beginning of the 20th century. And his pictures were characterized by, first of all, a calendar in the background very often, because these were going to be sent home to China. And so they'd know the day when it was taken, and it wasn't, if the person actually existed on that day. And the other element of these pictures, which is commented on a lot, is they had to show their fingers to show that they hadn't been mutilated, that they were all still alive and they were in good health. And this is Hoy himself in a self-portrait. And these are some of his other, just a few other images. And this one didn't quite all make it onto the screen, but there we are. But it was, again, in the small one, which is on the cover of the book of his images, which is available for sale. You can see this emphasis on showing that you're bodily okay. And then I wanted just add a couple of other things, and that's Bill Chu, who sent me some images. He went to Lytton and Lillooet, so the past is not only in the past, but he took pictures in 2009 of one of the mining sites where the Chinese mined historically. And then he also took a picture that he shared with me of a headstone from 1947 that's there in the Lytton-Lillooet area in a graveyard. So we have, the past, the old history is still there in this sense. What I wanted to end up with here is how the old history becomes a new history, because this is an article from The Economist in June 2006, when there was the apology, all this about Chinese immigration. And so there you have you have a head tax certificate which made it into the main news magazine in England. So that's the end of what I wanted to talk about as a kind of background to what we're doing, what's happening in the present time in terms of making this kind of history, which on the one hand, when you look at the images themselves, is very static, but tending to make it much more dynamic. But I would argue as well that a lot of these pictures do have a great deal of authenticity to them and shouldn't be thrown aside to make way for these two amazing people here. Hey, thank you.
When I was in high school, I'll go back, I'm a fourth generation BC resident, you could say, or second generation, depending on how you count it. My great-grandfather came here to help build the railroad. My grandfather and his brothers came, but they came alone. They left their wives and children in China. And so really, my parents only came in 1964, 65. And I was born in 1967. And so you could say I'm a fourth generation, or you could say I'm a second generation. And that kind of slippage is precisely because of the history of the Chinese in Canada and the anti-Chinese legislation and racism that led to things like the head tax and the Chinese exclusion of 1923. So when I was in high school growing up here, I wasn't a big fan of history. In fact, I hated history. When I was taking History 12, it was like endless dates of this treaty signed and that, and it just seemed this inexorable tide of what people were doing in Europe and then what they were doing when they came here. And everybody else was either on the margins or just sort of like, and by the way, there was some Chinese mining. Anyways, back to the real story. And so one of the things that I think was inspiring about the work of people like Gene Barman was, Gene was saying, no, there was a lot of other people already here, First Nations and Aboriginal peoples, and they didn't go away. They kept surviving, and to this day, they're still here. And there were other people who helped build the railroad, who in fact were often here before the majority of European migrants came. That's why they built the railroad, so that they could build the transportation that would bring most Europeans to the West Coast. It was very difficult to get here from Europe before that. So, why I wanted to go into that sort of long tangent was to suggest that I only became a historian because there was a possibility of thinking about history in a different way. Not in two different ways. One was that history is broader than the history that I learned in high school, and that it was more interesting as a broader history that included everyone who was here, and the conflicts, and the kinds of bad things that happened, but also not just what was done to people like Chinese and Aboriginal peoples, but what they were doing themselves. So, okay, so don't bother with the textbooks. I hated textbooks, hated dates, so why should I write a textbook and bore the heck out of 18 and 17-year-olds and 22-year-olds in my own classes at UBC? So one of the things was, let's use technology. And so one of the things that happened is, because of decades and decades of struggles for redress for the head tax, for apology, for redress, and there are quite a few of the activists here in the room today who fought for a long time, there was an apology in 2006, and there was a fund set up to document and create historical learning resources. And so we were very lucky to, at UBC and SFU, create a project which said we were going to use new technologies to try to create the most access to those histories. Right? And so that's what turned into the Chinese Canadian Stories Project. And it was going to create a website, and it's done, so you can go to it, which was trilingual in English, French, the two official languages of Canada, but also Chinese. And we thought that was important because that was the original language of the people who came. And in fact, we really wanted to honor that kind of tie to the migrants themselves. So it's a trilingual website. We also wanted to, in fact, use what we call the irony of discrimination, which is the Chinese were unwanted, which meant that there was a lot of records kept of every single one of them came. Did they pay the head tax? So there's a head tax registry with 97,123 entries, 97,123 entries, with 14 columns of information, what village they came from, how tall they were, whether they had scars on their face. If you came from Scotland and got off in the same period in Halifax, there would be virtually no record of you because you're welcome. Get off the boat, come on in. If you're Chinese, it's like, we want to know everything about you so that we can make sure you're not like trying to get around paying the head tax and all that kind of stuff. So the irony is that gives a lot of records for us to use. And so I had 3 students spend 18 months data entering, reading that horrible handwriting, and data entering everything to create a head tax database. And that allowed us to map, for instance, about 1/3 of their destinations between 1910 and 1923. Now, I want you to take a very careful look at that map. We think of the Chinese as being in Vancouver and Victoria, in Chinatowns. This is actually where they were, in every single small town across Canada, all the way through the Maritimes. The only reason Newfoundland is blank is because they weren't part of Canada yet. The Chinese did go to Newfoundland as well, and they paid a head tax there as well. So what this map, I hope, does is show you that the Chinese were an integral part of Canada all the way across, in every small town in the prairies, in every small town in the Maritimes and in central Canada, not just BC. Just in case you're thinking, well, maybe it was only 1 or 2. Well, actually, this is a weighted spot map, which shows you actually there are quite a few people in Toronto. There are quite a few people in the major cities. Yes, they're owning restaurants, they're running laundries, but they're doing a lot of things, but they're there. Okay, so their presence through Canadian history is strong. So one of the things we wanted to do, trilingual site, I'll actually just let this play.
Old photos, grainy black and white film. Who was in them? Who are they? What are their stories? For over 2 centuries, Chinese have been coming to Canada to work, to live, and to raise their families. Those old men in the photos, what dreams brought them to Canada? My name is Henry Yu. I was born in Vancouver in 1967, Canada's 100th birthday. The stories of the Chinese in Canada are still an uncommon history. So much has been forgotten, so much ignored. When I was in grade school, I learned about the racism and discrimination against the Chinese. But this project is not about what was done to the Chinese, but what they were doing. What will our children know about the place of Chinese Canadians in our history? What will they learn about those who paved the way for us? We're using the best technology to preserve the stories of Chinese Canadians. Students want to learn using the latest digital media, so we've worked with teachers to create resources that tell stories in new and powerful ways. We have held community workshops to work together with Chinese Canadians from across the country. In speaking with and listening to the stories of our elders, we are rediscovering our past and a sense of who we are. This project is about connecting young people with our past, to discover a passion for our history, and to allow them to create a sense of who we are. We still don't know enough about our uncommon histories. We need to create a common past so that together we can have a common future.
So that film was made by one of my students. So the idea here is, instead of me talking at students, like I'm talking at you today, and boring them, to get them involved in actually making the knowledge. So making films. Because right now, you know, if you're young, you've got smartphones, you've got, you know, digital cameras. You can create a short film with just the stuff you have on your body, literally, in any given day. And 30 years ago, it would have cost $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to do a short film. And you can upload it to the internet and have it mass distributed, literally, and people are accessing it. So that's what we're trying to take advantage in terms of the technological possibilities at this moment, that often someone my age is not either aware of or not very good at doing. And so we want to take advantage of the fact that someone's younger. It's the air they breathe. So one of the things we want to do is to connect across generations. So we had workshops in Vancouver, and there's a cache of old letters that is in the Yip Sang building, and it's in the Vancouver archives. But no one could read them because even though they're Chinese characters, they were written to capture an oral village dialect that some people still speak, but it's very difficult to decipher because they're using terms that aren't used anymore. And so we had a series of workshops to go through these letters with elders and literally go one character at a time and go, what's going on in this letter? Now, strangely enough, we discovered that a lot of letters were about, if they were sent to China, it was like, you know, I'm doing fine, da 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 da, I sent some money, what the heck are you doing with all this money? And then the letters that come the other way, it's like, we're doing fine, we got your money, we're running out of money, we need more money. So it was interesting, but very formulaic. Okay. I'm of course joking. One of the things that we found also was that the Chinese had a name, strangely enough, that was different for every place. It was in Cantonese or Toisan dialect or whatever. So places like Winnipeg, well, they had a different name. And so one of the things we did was create a spot map with all these different names in Cantonese that they had for places. That sounds sort of like trivial. It's not. That's actually quite an achievement to find out historically what places were called in the original village dialects. We also had our students involved in filming and interviewing and doing oral histories with elders so that those stories were not going to be lost when they passed away. Because it's those stories that give flesh and give insight into what people were actually doing and living historically. Often the kind of paper trail and the photographic trail, you have things like a photo, it's like unidentified Chinese man, Kirka 1900, location unknown. Whereas in a family photo, people know who's in that family photo until they pass away. And then that family album is full of photos which are, I don't know who that is. So unless there's a capturing of who is in those photos, you're not going to get an idea. Okay, we also help support, there was 29 different groups across the country that also received head tax redress funds. And one of our mandates was to help them when they had technological needs. So I'll just show you one example. The Ottawa Chinese Community Services Center, they had a project where they did interviews with about 20 different families around the Ottawa area of Chinese Canadians. Denise Chong, the famous writer, Concubine's Children, was actually the interviewer. And so what we did was that we'll help you in whatever way we can. We sent our film crew to help film, and then we also helped them in terms of designing little technological stuff. So this is one thing I'll just quickly show you.
I think my French is better than my Chinese.
In Vancouver, they think people in Ottawa are high up in the government. So they say, well, I have a son or grandson who's in China, who's waiting for a visa to come over. Can you do something about it? Gosh, I don't know a single politician in Ottawa.
Perhaps you know Harry Sim and Hin Lu, but do you know their stories? Now you can find a way into that past in the website Lives of the Family. To create this website, we interviewed descendants of some 20 families. We looked through family albums. We opened shoeboxes which stored photographs and documents, from head tax certificates to letters. On Lives of the Family, you can trace the immigration route of families from China, usually to points west and eventually to Ottawa and small towns nearby, like Smith Falls, Perth, Brockville. You can look at more than 200 old photographs. You can view video clips and listen to first-person stories. You'll find stories that mirror those of the Chinese across Canada.
Halfway here, they passed the Exclusion Act in 23, but fortunately, when she got into Victoria, through the assistance of the church where my father belonged to, she was able to get landed here.
Look for stories behind the photos. The Wong's eldest child, age 7, is marooned in China and missing from this one. Learn what made life different for the Chinese in Ottawa. Hin Lu noticed less anti-Chinese sentiment here.
Well, when I left Vancouver, I went to Toronto first. And there I felt a tremendous difference between the West and the East. I was very self-conscious though. When I moved around and I was looking for a room, the first question I asked was, do you take Chinese boarders?
Imagine the sense of isolation if you were the only Chinese family in town. Yet that was exactly what attracted the Langs.
My dad asked him, you know any restaurant in a small town for sale? So he said, yes, we know one in Cork.
Ottawa became a boomtown. Government jobs brought young Chinese like Hin Lu here. When Canada ended exclusion, Marion Hum and her husband were among the first immigrants in more than 2.5 decades. They opened their restaurant opposite Ottawa's Spurs shopping center.
Since Westgate is open, that's the gate. A gate needs a key to open the gate. So that's why we choose the name called Lucky Key. That's the name come from. But I think it's a good name anyway.
Some say stories like these are the same old story of Chinese laundrymen and restaurateurs. But from these beginnings, families established their lives here. They came in their Sunday best to church. They played hockey. They loved the great outdoors. They used their individual talents and pursued opportunity. Lives of the Family is a tale of Canada. Discover these stories. Share your own. Click on About Us on the website and contact us.
I want to skip forward a little. We also did a lot of focus on Chinese Aboriginal families. I won't talk that much about it, but just to say that if you want to go to our website, we have fridge magnets here to help you to get there. We put a lot of this all online, the oral histories. We also have a limited number, 3 DVDs here for the first 3 people to rush up here after we're done. I also wanted, we have a searchable head tax. All of those students who spend 18 months blinding themselves for the good of the rest of us, it's searchable. So if you have a head tax ancestor, you can try to find them on this searchable database at our website. We have a mobile interactive kiosk. It's in Vancouver Public Library right now in the main branch in the lobby. You can go try that out. It's also in Ottawa at the Public Library. We have a third one. Hopefully we'll go into the CCC soon in a couple months. We also work with teachers to work on, again, using technology to do learning games so that the students that they had would benefit. The Critical Thinking Consortium is a nonprofit nationwide. We worked with them, a lot of wonderful teachers. And so I'm just going to show you very quickly one of the things we did, which was to work with, again, students who are video game design students. And what we want to do is create an immersive experience to be able to plunge a grade 5 to 7 student into the world of 1911 in a small BC town. And so they will get to go around, play a video game, right, and explore the town, learn by doing what it was like, that how central the Chinese were, the restaurant owner, the grocery store owner, the laundryman, right? And they'll interact with the characters, collect stuff. All the stuff is actually archival material that is in the Chung collection, the Dr. Wallace and Madeline Chung collection at UBC or in the BC archives. And so they interact with history like I would as a historian and a researcher. So they're doing it hands-on while playing a game. And that would be something that a teacher could assign, go home and play this. But in class would be this other one we worked with teachers called Pages from the Past, which is, again, it's a learning game where they would go into the past by using a magic sort of photo scrapbook and help give advice to these people who would be their ancestors on decisions, 2 important decisions. So one of the characters is trying to decide whether to leave the village in China and join the husband in Canada with her kids, or is it better to stay in the village? So you have to learn about her, what her values are, and the student has to then give advice based on that. And if it's good advice, they get gold coins. If they give crappy advice, they don't get that gold coin. So gold is still there. It's called Pages from the Past.
Come, please sit down. Would you like a cup of tea? I am Quan Lam. I came to Canada in 1858, seeking gold. Allow me to introduce you to my family. We have had to make many difficult life decisions. Please help us consider the wisdom of our choices. My family members have been happy with their lives in Canada, but sometimes I wonder if they made the best decision. What advice would you give each of them? Help them on their journey, and I will share my goal with you. To give the best advice to my family, you must first identify their beliefs, values, and attitudes from their point of view, not your 21st century point of view. Second, consider the beliefs, values, and practices of the time to understand the factors beyond their control that affected their choices. My scrapbook has a page for 4 of my descendants. Carefully read and listen to the clues to better understand each of them. If at any time you are not sure what to do, click on my picture. I will help. If you offer good advice, I will give you some gold pieces from the Fraser Gold Rush. It is said, those who take advice gain wisdom. At the end of your journey, you can use my gold to give my descendants more than wisdom. You can use it to change their lives.
It's a wonderful, you can go online and play it yourself. If you have a nephew or a niece, probably ask them to help you. Okay, and finally, the last thing. We worked with Stanford to basically create a learning tool that was for researchers and for people interested. And we call it the gumball machine. And what this is it's a visualization using that database which shows each individual of those 97,123. We picked a small subset, and which village and county they're coming from and where they were heading. But just to sum up, one of the things we want to do, as I said, was to use technology in a way that is accessible, fun, so that history doesn't become something that is talked at people, but is a way to connect across generations, so that there's the transfer of knowledge across generations. And that's all education is. It's just one form of generational knowledge transfer. And so what we want to do is to get away from the idea that a teacher at the front of a room talks at a bunch of young people, and the generational transfer is an old person telling a young person what to think, versus having an interaction where that younger person, it's their curiosity, it's them who's building the knowledge themselves. It's going to be much more meaningful. And as they do things like interview an elder, then in creating the story for themselves, they're also learning about what it was like for their grandfather or grandmother. The best example, and if you go to our website, you'll see a short film we did with the great-grandchildren of C.D. Hoy that Jean Barman mentioned. And what that was about was just sort of talking about how they, for a school project, each of them discovered who their great-grandfather was. And you'll see them explaining to you who C.D. Hoy was. It's much more interesting to hear C.D. Hoy's great-grandchildren talk about who C.D. Hoy is and what it means to them than for me to talk to you about C.D. Hoy.
And my mother was the sixth daughter of C.D. Hoy.
I'm Joel McFarland. I'm 17 years old and I'm the great-grandson of Charles Hoy.
My name is Warren Lohr, and I'm the number one son of the number three daughter, Anne, of C.D. Hoy.
Hi, I'm Annika McFarland. I'm 14 years old and I'm the great-granddaughter of C.D. Hoy.
Hi, I'm Marissa McFarland. I'm 11 years old and I'm the great-granddaughter of C.D. Hoy.
My family, I have a brother, we moved to Quesnel in 1955, and we moved into the house my grandfather built, the Hoy house. It was built in 1934. Now, my grandfather came over, was born in 1883, so he would have been in his 60s when we lived in the house. So I have a number of memories of my grandfather. Sort of first and foremost, him being at the store. He had an office at the store. He was long retired. He often entertained customers and friends, and they'd come and visit him in his little office. I think it's fascinating the number of different things he did, number of different jobs he took to make some money to survive. The fact that he even hired a tutor to teach him English for like $5 when he only earned $5 a month. All the different jobs that he'd taken, the languages he had to learn, all the things that he had to do and really not only survive, but I would say was a success.
Very good survival instincts.
Because we lived in Quesnel, there was a number of native reservations around Quesnel, and so there was a lot of natives or Aboriginal people in the town. Many would come into the store to buy things. I was also quite aware of the relatively small Chinese population because they were mainly friends of C.D. Hoy or of my family. So we knew most of the Chinese families. But it was very different growing up in Quesnel, as I'm sure it is different for you kids growing up in North Van. And I would
Much work. Definitely a lot less work.
And I'm sure it would be valuable if your mom and your dad took you up to Quesnel sometime.
The project was you're supposed to do something about the past of BC or Canada, mostly BC, and my mom came up with the idea of my great-grandfather, and because he was, well, basically we wanted to make it more personalized than anyone else's projects. Before this project, I knew virtually nothing about who he was. I think I knew his name at most. That's about all. So this is very big understanding of my family's past, basically. What I wrote, the main topic of my project was his 17 different jobs, and through those jobs I basically portrayed his life and how he was living. And so he started out in China, and his parents were very poor, like the majority of China at that time, too much population, the government was greedy, all that sort of stuff. And then basically, so his father told him that the best way to make money would be to move to Canada. So he did that. He borrowed about $300 from his father and then moved all the way to Canada, all the way to Vancouver actually, specifically. And for the first little while, he wasn't very successful at helping his family. He barely made do with himself. He started out as a houseboy, and he was paid $5 a month, so that was a pretty low salary. Then after that, he managed to become a dishwasher, which was actually a larger salary than a houseboy, 3 times as much, $15 a month. And he was good at washing dishes, and he started helping around in the kitchen, that sort of stuff. And then he became a cook. And he was working at the Hudson Bay Company, actually. He was washing dishes and cooking for them, and he worked there for about 2 years. And then, well, basically he saw what the Hudson Bay Company was doing. He saw they were very good at fur trading, basically. And so he wanted to try to do that for himself. And so he went out, started buying furs, started selling them, but it wasn't a very good idea to compete with the Hudson Bay Company since they had such a monopoly over that sort of stuff. And so basically at that point he started losing money. And so he decided that was not a very good idea, moved to Barkerville and became a pan miner, which is, you take a pan, look for gold in the rivers and stuff. He didn't do good at that job either because the river actually froze over. Then after that, the closest job by was a lumberjack. Well, so he became a lumberjack. And after that, he saw what the people, basically he was cutting wood for surveyors and stuff, and so he decided to become a surveyor, but he also didn't really like that job very much, so he quit that. After that, this is when he started becoming successful. He moved to Quesnel, actually. He became a photographer. He also started cutting people's hair, and then he'd repair watches too. So, and then using money from that, he became a general store owner. Shortly after he started becoming successful as like a general store owner and that sort of stuff, his mom arranged a wedding for him. And he wasn't really happy about that because he had just started being able to pay for his family and himself. And as soon as he returned, he became a farmhand. Then he decided to try and buy and sell cattle, but after that he tried to do the same with gold. So he became a gold vendor, gold seller. And he wasn't good at that. And then he started owning land and selling land, which, as with cattle, he was also bad at. So he stopped doing that and just rebought his general store. But then in 1970, Safeway started becoming a big thing, and he realized he couldn't compete with them, so he actually sold his general store at that point. He owned his general store for a total of 60 years, though. Near the end of his life and career, he built and became the owner of Wells Lights and Power Company. He basically supplied power to the entire western side of Wells. And he also owned a theater. He made good profits from most of that stuff and had a very good life. He would have liked to have a few more jobs though, because he wasn't able to get an education at any point within those years, so he wanted to become maybe a teacher, doctor, lawyer, banker, engineer, but just wasn't able to get an education, was too busy working. So he would have liked to do that, but he always lacked the education. So that was basically his life. See, I don't know anything about my dad's side of the family, so it's rather interesting when I think about it because I know a lot about one grandparents. I think you'd probably want to know about one side of your family line, just because it's a very interesting experience.
So Annika decided to do, her project was C.D. Hoy's store, and these were some of the objects that might have been sold in there.
Well, this is a chewing tobacco can, and I think he sold it in his store. Well, all the stuff he sold in his store. And then this is a teapot, and a cup. And these are his shears that he used for barbering. And a watch, because he used to repair watches. And a cowbell. I would probably say that he was a photographer, and he took a bunch of really important pictures that show what it was like in a small town, and that he owned a general store. That was pretty interesting. Has a lot of, and we have a lot of stuff that was sold in that store. Well, I think it's good to know where you come from, and we didn't really, well, I don't think we really cared that much, but now that we know, it's, you know, it's important, and it's interesting too. It's interesting to see where they're from and what they did and who they are and everything, and so now we know.
I did the photography of Chow Dong Hoi and compared it to mine. So his photography was around 100 years ago and mine was 2 years ago. So this one is my great-grandfather that he took with his camera. And so I tried to kind of do the same style with mine, but different, of course. This one is a picture of me and my sister that my brother took for his project. Yeah. So he also tried to do the same style as C. Hoy, which was supposed to be serious, because if you look in the pictures, they're all pretty serious, but you couldn't contain yourself, so you're smiling. Take pictures of himself. He would attach a string onto the shutter release, which is this, and there's a little hole in it so he could attach it, and he would pull the string when he wanted to take the picture. I learned that it was kind of amazing how he had all these things. Yeah, and when I read my brother's project and how he did some of the jobs, it was interesting. Yeah. Happiness like this is rare. And I'm going down to the general store in the cowboy bar right next door. Gonna dance to the local band and raise a glass to this mountain land. Raise a glass to this mountain land. Strange, the prairie lands and the mountain range. You let go of your fear and your lonely rage. You take a deep breath and you turn the page. Well, you can do it together, you can do it apart. You can use your head or you can use your heart, but be sure that you try with all your might to make your heavy load seem light. And I'm going down to the general store in the cowboy bar.
And so that's really the essence of what using technology is. It's not technology for an end in itself, just because it's gee whiz and cool. but because technology is a tool to allow us to do better what we all aim to do, which is to transfer knowledge between generations so that the young don't forget what the old went through, so that the elders, don't think that they've been forgotten, ignored, left behind, as if they're irrelevant. So often, when we first ask an elder to do an oral history, they're very reticent because, oh, I didn't do anything interesting. I had a very boring life. But when it's someone in their own family, a younger person in their family saying, please, can you tell us the story of your life? The transformation, and you see it again and again, is amazing. Because what you get there is this new sense now that there isn't a forgetting, that within that family itself, you have younger people who actually care about what their parents, their grandparents did. And that, to me, is the magic. And if you can capture that within classrooms and within this kind of larger sense of education and public history, then you've got something. And so I'll end with that. I think using new genres to do history, we're all thinking historically, actually, at any moment. Otherwise, you're an amnesiac and you don't even know who you are. So history and memory and identity are all intertwined. And so I think that's the way to approach what we're doing. Thanks.
For those who know me, they know I'm an architect, and everyone's looking at this and saying, why are you doing this comic book for? And this is my little story, okay? My name is David Wong. I'm a 5th generation Canadian. Very proud of the fact that I am a Canadian, though my ancestors started some nation south of the border, and we'll learn about this nation here as I move along. First thing is that I've got to be honest here. I've always wanted to become a cartoonist since I was a kid, but having Asian parents, there's no way that I could become a cartoonist. So I wanted to follow my other passion, which is becoming a frog biologist. And again, it was either that or the chicken feather stick. So I said, okay, I'll do something decent. I'll become an architect. So that's what I did. One of the things I have to admit is that I was a really, really tough kid to look after. I was really rotten, handful, and I haven't changed a bit. I think they call it attention deficit now, but one of the things I want to talk about is history in itself. Most kids think of history as a very boring topic. Henry was saying that, so I thought, I'm going to try something different. There's something I really want to do something I really wanted to do when I was young, and that was do a comic book. We're going to do a comic book or graphic novel. Have fun doing it because, these are your own little things like getting back to people. And one of the best things I did was I put a lot of Chinese swear words, and the editors and the guys were just going through this, and they don't know what it means, of course. They made me take all the good, nasty words like, what word I go like, go hump a chicken. I think I left that one in there. But I have nastier words like, there's young people here, but I won't really see it. SOB and things like that. Because, you have to convey the feeling of some of the people, some of the words. And they made me do some research. And they asked me, David, did people use that word, let me think of a word now, like damn you or whatever, right? And that was a pretty nasty word there. Or go to hell. Those are really nasty words, equivalent to the F word now we have in today's society. So I had some fun. I went back in time and looked for 18th century swear words. And I found some really good ones. And I had them in there, but they made me take them all off because they were too nasty, because they say, well, some people who are sensitive to, these names may be offended. So I left the Chinese one there, like Kai-I. Hey, anyone knows what Kai-I means? So I wrote it in English, K-A-I-A-I-I, right? Right? And there's some other ones in there too, but I'm not going to say it because I'm going to be arrested. So those were left in there, so have fun, okay, if you guys are going to do a book. I gave a presentation to our neighbors to the south. I was down at near UCLA in San Francisco. So I had to make them feel really proud that there's a lot of American content. So I talked about the old gold mining town, gold rush towns there. And I had to let them all know where Vancouver was. So there it is. There's our little town, Vancouver. So I had a lot of fun, again, because I wanted this to be a resource for people to learn. And I had a goal that every page they've got to learn something new, something interesting, without them even knowing about it. So I embedded information into my little book here. And of course, we talked about the usual stuff, the Exclusion Act of 1882 in the US, our head tax here in Canada in 1923. And more important, I want to talk about some heroes. Because not every single person was a, we can say, and every single white person was a racist. I want people to know that there were also people who stood up for everyone. And one of them was Mark Twain. And people, and some of the folks in the audience, the Asian Americans, were really offended. Because, he was a bloody racist, David. Well, don't use the word bloody. An awful racist, I think they had used that word. And I go, well, why? What makes you think so? Because, well, he used the word Chinaman, Chinaman this, Chinaman that. So I said, if you go back 100 years ago, Chinaman was a term they used to describe, Asians. We call them Asians now, but one time we call them, Orientals or whatever. And then there's Chinamen, there's Englishmen, there's Frenchmen. So that might be a reason. But, if you look at what he did, he wrote a book called Roughing It. I think it was 1871. And he actually talked about the why a Chinese person was actually valuable to American society. And he actually had an audience with Ulysses Grant, the president at the time, and talked about this. We had the same here in Canada. Senator Almond, he also stood up and spoke. And there were many others. And I had to make sure that I gave pages to recognize these individuals who not so much Mark Twain, but other people who maybe are forgotten through time. So that to me was very important. One of the more important things I wanted to talk about and show was the long and respectful relationship between Aboriginal First Nations people and the Chinese community. And this is something I really want to capture in my book. So I'll let you guys read it, and so it's in here. Let's just go, for example, when I talk about learning, the Ottawa, the central tower there, it's different from what we have today because it burnt down, and there's a little bit about there. The map of Canada, how it used to be. It used to be District of Athabasca, and how so these are things that people would learn along the way. That last spike, there's several last spikes, and it was bent, and so I want to have fun showing that. Some of the heroes we have, Larry Kwong, first Chinese NHL player, Shirley Yu Fong, first Chinese-American assemblywoman, but it's also about healing. The main message I want to carry out is about let's not carry the hatred and the disrespect that our ancestors had. It's all about learning. And if we can learn about these things and pass on to the next generation, I think it'd be a nicer place. And this story here, one of my penultimate stories, is about Frank Wong. Frank is a person in town. It's a real hero to me and to many. He served for Canada at a time when Chinese were not recognized as citizens. Frank ended up in Normandy at D-Day, came back to Canada. His daughter married a Canadian whose father served for Nazi Germany, and he was also at Normandy Beach on the other side. And their children married, and they're still happily married today. So this is a true story. So that's in my book, and these are some things I want to capture. And I also want to talk about the reconciliation efforts that's happened of recent. This is a Tacoma. There was a thing called the Tacoma method, where they burnt down the Chinatown Tacoma, and they were proud of it and called it the Tacoma method. A few years back, the city of Tacoma recognized this injustice and created a park. And of course, we have our own. We have our Prime Minister apologizing for the head tax. And recently, Betty Luke, the lady in the center, her brother was the first Chinese-American elected official in the Pacific Northwest. The Wing Luke Museum is named after him. And of friendship, I wanted to emphasize the relationship of Aboriginal peoples and of the Chinese. So this is one of the things I tried to capture, that all peoples are brothers. But sorry, I just got to go through this really quickly because I see Hannah there breathing down my neck. So thank you, everyone. Question time, right?
I'll just start with the schools. When we worked with TC Squared, the Critical Thinking Consortium, the whole rationale was to work with teachers right away. They're a nationwide set of teachers. And so we had done a project, a group of us before, on the anniversaries of the 1907 riot in 2007. And we worked with the BCTF and TC Squared at that time. And what it was 6 teachers created these learning resources on the 100th anniversary of that. Immediately upon the completion of it, 109 teachers adopted the resource. And the reason why is because teachers only adopt things that other teachers that they trust produced, and when another social studies 10 teacher says, yeah, I use this, it works, then they will adopt it. And so rather than trying to work in a way in which we would come to try to convince schools, the Ministry of Education or whatever. There's a lot of official curriculum and resources that are sitting on shelves at the Ministry of Education that no one uses because someone produced it for a teacher without actually talking to a teacher. So the model we repeated here that we did with the 1907 anniversaries project was work with teachers, have them produce the resources. And so right now TC Squared is debuting it at professional development days across the country in every province. I show up every once in a while and say, this is cool, but I don't matter really to a social studies 10 or social studies 6 teacher. It's another teacher who says this works or this is why I like it that matters. And so in some sense, if there are teachers here, if you go play the games and things and you like it, then you're sort of emailing another teacher and saying, hey, this is a cool thing that I heard about or I was at MOV. That's what's going to get it distributed and used. And so that's the lesson in some sense that we didn't learn. It's that we sat with teachers and we talked about and we asked things like, when do you do something new and why? And it never was some guy at UBC told us it was good. It was always a fellow teacher, emailed me or sent me something as an attachment or said, hey, there's this URL, check it out if you need to do this or that. And so, and we don't track that because that's actually very, we track it on our website and when people download and use stuff, but we've seen adoption and use of things across the board. It's just that we've allowed it to operate in that organic way between teachers, and that's why we were so important to work with TC Squared in the first place, because they were a nonprofit that was across Canada. For that answers it. Because when you first posed the question, the first thing I thought is that it's not what's missing, but what's not connected. So right now, Ancestry.ca and Ancestry.com are actually quite popular websites. People who do a lot of family history, they want to know. There's a disconnect in some sense between a kind of popular sense of history. You watch History Channel and you really like watching the shows, and a kind of more official set of histories that are generally about nation building and who belongs in Canada, who really built it, and who we should celebrate. And often those are at odds. And to me, what's missing in some sense is something that, again, Jean and others have tried so hard over their careers to fight against, is this separation of what normal people think of as history versus what is the official or the academic. There's various other forms of official history. And so what's missing to me is not as much something that's not being done, but a way of having conversations across those divides between museums and academics, between museums and the people they serve. The 19th Century Museum was created to sort of edify and educate the unwashed and uneducated, and so it was a one-way process. To me, the transfer of knowledge is always this two-way process that goes, and that can go between generations, like we've been talking about, but also even just between, again, having conversations with David and talking about what he's trying to do and what we're trying to do at UBC, but they're not different. Mm-hmm. And once you start to have more of those kinds of conversations across, then I think you're getting a broader sense of history. So what's missing in some sense are the ways in which we've separated out history between capital H official histories and social histories, popular histories, and things like that. And so technology, again, to me, is one of the tools to be used so that people can do their own histories, keep them recorded, and we can save them, we can distribute them, we can have conversations around those stories that you've mentioned.